Okay, well, let's get started then. So once again, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar with Greg Gillespie of Legal Connect, who will be providing advice about effectively using private investigators. As you may know, my name is David. I'm the founder of DG Legal. The slides from this afternoon's presentation will be sent over to you tomorrow, and a recording of the webinar will be available afterwards, so you're free to watch the rest if you need to leave early at another time. Now, the webinar is due to last for an hour. That's how much time we've allowed for it, but I think it might finish a little early. We are in webinar mode, so that means we can't see or hear any of you. So please use the Q&A function so that Greg can answer your questions, which I think he'll do at the end of the webinar. Please do use Q&A in preference to chat because it's just a little bit easier for us to follow the questions. If you can do that, please, and then just use the chat function if you want to say hello or a goodbye, etc. Now, Greg is the founder of Legal Connect, and he's got an extensive background in private investigation, litigation support, and high-profile cases. This has included his evidence being used by the Maltese government as part of the prosecution of senior politicians on charges of corruption, money laundering, bribery, and trading in influence, just to name a few. His work has been used by the FBI and the US Department of Justice as part of an investigation into allegations of fraud relating to a chain of private hospitals, which went into administration. Now, Greg recently did a webinar for us and it was absolutely great. So no pressure, Greg, but see if you can top your previous webinar. Over to you.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, let me just start by saying thank you for DG Legal for inviting me at all. Secondly, back, it's good to be here. And thank you for all those that have joined. I did many years ago, used to do a lot of teaching, and these days I don't. So I've been quite looking forward to doing this because it's a subject that I'm quite passionate about and enjoy doing, and getting the opportunity to do this is something that I look forward to. So yeah, so as David said, there'll be a Q&A at the end. I might actually have to just with David help on that sort of Q&A questions coming in as we did last time. But yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions, and of course after this course I will do a condensed version of the slides which I'll hand over to DG Legal. But I'm also available to contact anytime. So yeah, so without further ado, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to start. Just very quickly, a little bit of housekeeping. Yeah, you know who I am. It's going to be 60 minutes, but I'm going to try and do that a little bit quicker than that. Questions, ask away. And as I said, after this, if you need to contact me about anything, you can. So do get in touch. So the content, so this is a webinar based on understanding the world of private investigators and how that relates to the legal world and sort of using them in general. So the content, we're going to have a look at who private investigators actually are, and you may be quite surprised by that very first one, the answer to that anyway. We're going to look at private investigators and the law, the services that they offer, the various risks of using private investigators, and there are a lot. There's a couple of case studies we're going to go through. I was actually spoiled for choice on how many case studies there were, so I've chosen a few relative to some specific points I'm going to make in other aspects of the content. Perhaps most importantly is for you guys to understand how to protect yourself when using private investigators, because it's a industry that is very little is sort of known about, understood about. And there are a lot of pitfalls and issues that you need to avoid. And I'll explain a little bit more about the business models usually used within the private investigation world, so you know what you're getting involved in if you hire PIs. So essentially, I sort of see my objective is of giving you guys an overview of understanding the world of private investigators in relation to the legal industry, how it all works, and how to essentially stay safe if you decide to instruct anybody. So my background, just very, very quickly, I'm not from a law enforcement background at all. In fact, I'd argue that most PIs aren't. There's always an issue when it comes to when you're talking about cases, because you're working with someone or an organization where it's completely confidential. So trying to advertise what you've done, when you did it, how you did it, where you did it is a real challenge, because most of it you just can't talk about. But some of the big cases that I can talk about that David alluded to are in the public domain, and they were pro bono for various reasons. So I can talk about those to some degree, which I will today. Those cases relate to international organised crime, which I got involved in investigating this particular organised crime group by complete accident. And it then opened a can of worms, because then I was involved in this case relative to what one could say was political fraud and corruption, which is still going on. And another case by pure coincidence, which is in the public domain, related to threats to life at a care home, because it involved my 100-year-old grandmother. She was in a care home that got shut down under emergency legislation by the local government because of serious safeguarding issues. And the care home got shut down and they all got moved to other private care homes. And then as part of that, obviously I wasn't very happy about that. So I started looking into it and found other issues around that, but that's covered in the public domain, which is quite an interesting case. If we were here in the old-fashioned way, where we meet face to face and don't do it online, this would be the quiz area, and we'd be saying, who is this guy? Well, this guy is Joseph Muscat, or Muscat, depending upon where you're from. He's the former Prime Minister of Malta. As David said, he is being charged at the moment in relation to a number of allegations, which include embezzlement, money laundering, trading in influence, bribery, etc., etc. Apart from that, I'm sure he's a very nice guy, but he's facing a few cases relating to this, as are, I think it's about 30 senior politicians and civil servants and a load of other people. And it was in relation to, there's all sorts going on in Malta. Malta's a really interesting case in itself, if you're interested in sort of, dare I say, true crime, because of course there was the very famous assassination of the late great Daphne Caruana Galizia, the journalist who was murdered in Malta. She was uncovering various things and paid for it with her life, sadly. So Malta is a really interesting sort of case study, but essentially I looked into this Swiss consultancy who there was reason to believe were involved in financial crime, and found out there were links between them and the government of Malta in relation to a hospital scandal. So Malta essentially had, I think it was 3 hospitals on their own NHS, which they sold to the private sector. Lots of issues, lots of things happened. So I got involved in that, and the evidence that I gathered is being used as part of the prosecution, which I'm very proud of. But that's ongoing. On the other side of that is this chap here in all 4 photographs, whose name, I believe this is how you pronounce it, John Boehner, who was he was the Lindsay Hoyle of the US government. He was the Speaker of the House, so very senior. And then he became involved with this hospital chain in America called Steward Healthcare. Now, Steward Healthcare went bankrupt, and as part of their bankruptcy, your hospitals closed. I think it's about 30 odd hospitals closed. Doctors and nurses lost their jobs. There's even cases of people sadly dying because of not having the equipment and the kit they needed to care for people because of problems, financial issues, let's call them. So although I'm not allowed to go into much detail, it is listed in this article that I had an involvement in a limited capacity in relation to what they called the FCPA, which was the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which was basically a law that said that American companies aren't allowed to pay bribes or do anything like that. And because the company that took over the concessions in Malta were American, i.e. Steward Healthcare, there is an overlap there. So yeah, but I can't really go into that much. But if you're interested in it, go online and search Bernie Sanders, the former Democratic presidential candidate for nomination. I think he lost to Hillary Clinton because he launched this tirade at Steward Healthcare when it turned out that after the hospitals went bankrupt, they found all the money that they'd been spending on private jets, luxury yachts, all sorts of stuff like this that they shouldn't have been spending money on when, you know, all was going on. So if you're interested in that case, look at Bernie Sanders Steward Healthcare on YouTube, because it is quite fascinating. So let me crack on. So who are private investigators? Well, There's an assumption that a lot of ex-police become PIs, which is true. A lot of ex-police do, although I would argue the majority of the industry are probably not police officers. And this, in some respects, is a bit of a challenge because it means that anybody can advertise their services as being a private investigator, and can offer services and sell services as being a private investigator. So it means that in this industry, there's lots of challenges. There's no accountability. You don't need any qualifications. There's zero barriers to entry. There's no licensing. There's no regulation. And there's also, and maybe a little controversial, I would argue that there is an old boys network in the PI world, in the private investigation world, because there's just no oversight at all whatsoever. And I would argue even the oversight that is there is not really fit for purpose, as we'll see as we go through this this workshop. But it's a real mix, and this is one of the dangers, because when you come to hire someone, there's kind of very little you can go on as to who am I hiring, what are they doing, etc., etc. Which is why at the end of this workshop, I do have a slide I'll show you on what you can do to protect yourself when hiring people, because you do get, anyone can just set up a website, put up a phone number, start offering services, saying X, Y, Z, and there's a whole litany of issues that you could face. So when it comes to private investigators and the law, as in the first question, what legal powers do private investigators have? Well, firstly, if we're talking about the UK, they have no legal powers whatsoever. There are no, there's nothing for them. They can't access things that you can't, etc., etc. There are a few exceptions of access to certain data, but even then, you know, certain companies would still be able to access that. When we work abroad, we have to be always aware of the legal status of private investigators in those territories overseas, because they vary a lot. And in America, it's kind of state by state, but over here, there are no legal powers whatsoever. And it kind of makes you question, well, why do you need them then? Well, it depends what sort of job they're going to do, which we'll come to. But it's kind of like, I always think of it like being a mechanic. Outside of doing an MOT, which has to go through a certain legal process, kind of anyone can do it if you go and get the training and you have the knowledge, etc., etc. So this idea that a private investigator can do things that you guys can't, well, in theory that's not true, because all you needed to do was be aware of it and get the skills. So there's no particular law or any laws around private investigators and investigations, which is pretty problematic. In my opinion, the most important law that a private investigator needs to be aware of, and of course, all laws we have to be aware of, and we can't break the law, and etc., etc. But there is one that I would argue is the most important that a PI needs to be aware of, and it's also a bit of a let's call it a red flag for you guys if a PI doesn't feel like this, and that is data protection and GDPR. For a number of reasons, but one primarily, if we just have a quick look into this, when we think about data protection and GDPR, it's about gathering people's personal data and consent in layman's terms. And again, I'm no lawyer, but in layman's terms, that's what it's about. It's about having the right to have someone's personal data. When it comes to being an investigator, I think being the investigation industry in the UK is probably the only industry where, when it comes to GDPR and data protection, it is the only industry where personal data is gathered without the data subject's consent, which makes it very, very unique, because the very notion of gathering intelligence and investigations covertly is that the person doesn't know. And this makes it a bit of a minefield, or it can be if people don't know what they're doing. Now, obviously, you guys as lawyers, you'll know this far more than I will, but it's the idea that the law is always behind. So stuff has to happen that then makes laws come into play, by which hopefully we all abide. With a lot of issues relating to private investigators, a lot of this is untested. And although there's been issues in the past, some of which we're going to have a look at in relation to things like phone hacking and the News of the World scandal, which was aimed at journalists, although we'll look at that in a bit more depth, a lot of PI issues just aren't. It's kind of, it it's almost as if because it hasn't been tested, people do stuff that they kind of get away with. Now, there are, in the worst case scenarios, there are some cases at the moment that are in the public domain which I think will lead to certain changes. And that's because certain newspapers have been made aware of certain things, which we'll go through. It's one of them is a case study that I've got where, because of what's happened, the actions of investigators are now being scrutinized and may well result, I hope, in laws being changed. So we'll come to that in a little more depth. We then have things like surveillance. So the definition of surveillance is that it's the continuous observation of a person, place, vehicle, or object, either covertly or overtly. And we hear about it a lot. First of all, in the public domain in relation to state level matters, but it's used a lot in the private sector. Now, there's a piece of legislation called RIPA, which relates to covert surveillance, which we'll have a look at now. So RIPA is the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, to get my teeth in, say that. So the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act. And when you see sort of tabloid newspapers talking about spy laws, they're talking about RIPA. And this means that permission has to be granted in order for covert surveillance to be used. So again, I'm not a lawyer, but the specific aspects of this, there's kind of three broad things we need to be aware of. One is that, is it a necessity? Do we really need to capture someone's data covertly in order to achieve X, Y, Z? The second is what we're suggesting proportionate? Do we need to have a 5-person team and trackers and blah, 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 in order to get what we need to get? And the third one is collateral intrusion and making sure that we limit it. So what we mean by collateral intrusion is capturing other people's data as part of the task of capturing the subject or the target's data. Which is ironic that, the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, really, that aspect overlaps with GDPR, because it all comes back to data capturing, whether that's photographs being taken, videos, audios, reports being written with people's data in, et cetera, et cetera. What's unique about RIPA, though, is that it only applies to public institutions. It doesn't apply to the private sector. So the police, the government, the local authorities, any public institution has to abide by RIPA, yet the private sector doesn't, because it just doesn't apply to the private sector. So what we have to be aware of is that you'll see PIs talking about RIPA and they abide by RIPA. Really what they're saying is we don't need to abide by RIPA, but we do out of good practice, out of ethical considerations. And if surveillance needed to be used as part of a job that went to court, then from the belt and braces point of view of the investigator, it is a very good idea to have abided by this, even though it isn't necessarily a legal requirement. And I had a job, in fact, it's sort of alluded to in this, where we were following a target relating to the crime, the organised crime case I talked about at the beginning, where one of the targets was meeting a family member who had a young child. And when the surveillance team reported to me, we followed the target to here, they've met this individual's got a young child, what do you want to do? We made the decision that actually the likelihood of that individual talking about criminality in front of a family member who we didn't believe was involved in anything and would not have been aware, and capturing the data of a child was not right. So a decision was made at that point to say to the team, okay, continue observations, but don't capture any data. They went for a meal, and then after the meal, they went their separate ways, and the target was followed, and then the recordings went back on. And we did that because we felt that it wasn't right to capture the data of a child if the child had nothing to do with it. So it's just kind of best practice, but it isn't a legal requirement. When we look at private investigators and what services they offer, again, it's a really bizarre one, because when I first got involved in this industry, and again, I don't have a background from sort of law enforcement or anything like that, I conducted a sort of analysis of the UK industry to understand how I would fit in it and where the opportunities were. And one of the biggest sort of lessons I learned was that not all private investigators actually investigate anything, which was a bit of a shock to me. So the private investigation industry really is an umbrella term, and it encompasses a lot of different services and a lot of different segments in across a lot of different industries. So the sort of idea of a PI as we know it through TV and all the rest of it is not really true. What I found was that really one segment related to litigation support. So that would be process serving, tracing, maybe an asset report. This technically falls to private investigators, even though a process serving isn't really an investigation. Tracing, yeah, one could argue is an investigation, and asset reports, yeah, okay, that's a type of investigation. But it's not what people really think if someone says that they're a private investigator. So a lot of the work that we do with law firms is providing this service. The other side of it is the sort of more investigative aspect. So this could be intelligence reports, again, with the legal sector. It could be covert investigations. It could be running surveillance jobs. But there's also an aspect of corporate work. So a lot of the work that we do outside of working with lawyers is working with corporates as a type of security consultancy to protect them from hostile intent. So IP being stolen, even if a competitor is trying to cause them problems, or just general security issues. So that the services that a PI will offer really vary, and this also comes down to the business model, which we'll look at in a moment. So, for example, if a lawyer wanted an intelligence report, that could be for commercial due diligence, and that's something we've done when we've acted on behalf of a client who's maybe buying another company or getting involved in business or a partnership with another entity, and they want really in-depth due diligence, then they'll come to us and we will do that. We'll also run covert investigations. So, for example, that fraud investigation, that was completely covert. That included aspects of surveillance. A surveillance investigation could relate to brand protection. So if there was an organization that sold goods and they thought that their goods were being, there was counterfeit goods going out on the market, and trading standards weren't looking into it, or they wanted to move quicker, or they wanted more evidence, surveillance might be used to go and do test purchasing or try and validate where the items are being made, etc. But for litigation support, the standard offering of private investigators is actually tracing and process serving, which, as I said, isn't really investigating anything. The way the business model works is that it's a really fragmented industry, and the best sort of comparison, I think, is thinking about the housing industry, and how there's elements of subcontraction to it, which I'll come to. But you'll get private investigators that have different skills. So you'll get some investigators that only do surveillance, and some that will do like handwriting analysis, or genealogists, or forensic accountants, or you'll get a whole breadth of different types of services that an investigator offers. You'll also get the B2C and the B2B models within private investigations. So really, because of the subcontraction, quite often you will be using a firm who then subcontract certain aspects of the job to other particular agents. So you get people that are B2B, you get people that say, I only do this, you get organizations that offer all the complete services, you get a complete range. You get a variance across the market as well. So there are certain PI firms that will work purely with legal clients or with corporate clients. The public private investigators working with the public is where the majority of the problems are, because a lot of the public don't know what they can and can't do. A lot of private investigators in the sort of public that represent members of the public, there are a lot of issues there which we'll come to, which is predominantly why I and the guys I work with only work with lawyers or corporates. If a private client comes to us, it's usually because of a legal issue or a corporate issue. And if it is totally a personal case, there are a lot more things we need to go through before we start doing any work with them, which is one of the reasons why I don't really work with private clients personally. It's legal and corporates. Within that, you also have the positioning of the private investigator. You know, there are a lot of backstreet sort of agencies that it's a race to the bottom in terms of cost and the services that they offer and the value that they offer, right up to the sort of first class offerings at the top end of the market. So you get a really broad. So this idea of what a private investigator is, it could be a multitude of different things in different ways at different levels. So as I said, it's very much like the housing industry, where really when you instruct a firm, so for example, when a lawyer instructs me to do something, unless it's something that's very specific to my sort of core skill set, I actually have a team of subcontractors who I've used before. And if I don't, I can source other subcontractors. So in that instance, I become a type of project manager. So if a large job comes in, really what the client is coming to us for is that one stop, one point of call. Ultimate responsibility lies with us. We handle all the issues and all the details, and we just hand over the work or the report or however it is that the client wants it, because within that there are lots of other things going on. And you may also find as well that with some of the big security firms, of which there's some very, very high-end ones, charging huge amounts of money, which some of which we're going to have a look at, you'll often find with them what they're doing is just subcontracting further down the supply chain. So there's some cases which we'll have a look at in a moment, where huge amounts of money was spent, and it was just them essentially taking a cut at the front end, but outsourcing another firm to do it, another firm to do it, another firm to do it. So it's kind of like, I don't know who said it, it's quite a famous quote about you'll never be sacked for hiring Microsoft. And it's the idea that, well, why would people hire a firm that are going to charge them a fortune if they can go somewhere and get the same quality at a lower price? But often that comes from the positioning of the organization. But actually, the idea that a top firm and a smaller firm or a boutique agency, that there would be a difference between what they're capable of doing, it's actually, I would argue that's not really true, because no one has any particular unique access. No one has any particular unique laws that they can abide by that other people can't, et cetera, et cetera. So what you're going to find is that quite often with those sorts of companies, actually the price point can be a bit of a, say, a red herring, but it can be a bit of a myth, because they can't do, a top end firm can't do anything extra in theory to a smaller firm or a lower end firm. So what are the risks of using, I'm conscious of time, what are the risks of using private investigators? Well, firstly, there's no SRA. So as a consumer, which in theory you would be if you hired a PI, there's kind of no one you can go to and say, I've worked with these guys and they've ripped me off. You're kind of on your own. Being implicated in criminality or dodginess, if you hire a dodgy PI who does things they shouldn't be doing, that's something obviously you've got to avoid at all costs. Mainly with private clients, one of the rogue issues that exists in the private industry is that a private client will speak to somebody on the end of the phone who they can't validate who it is. They tell them the problem and what they want to do, and they pay the money probably up front, which they shouldn't do really, to go and sort it out, and then they get blackmailed, and the PI then goes back to them and says, how much is it worth for me not to approach the person you're talking about and tell them everything you want me to do? And a lot of the associations have to deal with complaints from the public about dodgy things like this going on, which again comes back to being ripped off by unethical practices. There are reputational risks depending upon who you hire and the work they do. And very controversially, my final word of advice on this one is actually trusting associations. There are a number of private investigation associations, not just in the UK, but around the world. And some of them have appalling reputations. And they claim to be ethical and law-abiding, but they are just have dreadful reputations and a lot of things that go off that shouldn't go off. So, if we have a look at a couple of case studies here, and for the sake of legal reasons, I can't identify which agencies or people or associations I'm referring to, because then it also means that I'm highlighting who's good and who's not, and it could, so I can't identify who, but this is some great examples. So one is an organization that tells its potential customers that they're there to protect the public, and they have a stringent vetting process. So only the best get let in, and they have the highest of standards, and blah 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 blah, all the right corporate things that you'd expect PIs, or in fact anybody really, to say in terms of what they offer. But this is an example of one of their members. Now I've had to redact it, but essentially, if you just read down to the final paragraph, this was an individual who was a police officer who was sacked from the police on 2 counts of gross misconduct and 1 of misconduct, and was dismissed from the police without notice. I believe this individual, there's a few cases like this. I believe this one was sexual assault. If it wasn't sexual assault, it was sexual harassment, but there's a few cases like that. And you'd think, wouldn't you, that if an organization says it's got the highest of standards, they wouldn't let in somebody who wasn't good enough to be in the police and had been found to guilty, whatever the right terminology is, of gross misconduct and misconduct on these sorts of allegations, but they were allowed in. And that's one of the dangers. That's why due diligence is important, which I'll come to in a moment. We've also got the Prince Harry case versus MGM newspaper. I could have talked about the phone hacking case. In fact, there's loads of cases, but this one was the most recent. And this is where Prince Harry went after the Mirror Group newspaper for illegal, I can't remember the exact term, but it was essentially, he felt that his data had been illegally gathered, sold to the press, used by the press to sell papers and stories, etc., etc. One particular private investigation firm, when this case was in the public domain, put out a statement condemning, the actions of these people, and saying that the controversy, infamously referred to as phone hacking, and the actions taken by those dishonest opportunities posing as private investigators have sparked a lot of attention once again. So this organization jumped on this and said, this is disgraceful, and that, that shouldn't be happening, and ultimately this is why we're different, etc. What they didn't tell the world was that one of the main witnesses in that case was actually a member of their association. It was just like, really? And the individual in question admitted, I believe, to blagging and having insider persons in certain organizations to essentially, I think it was to buy information off them, which of course is illegal gathering of intelligence. And they were also accused of being involved in hacking and being dishonest, although they denied it. But this was a senior person in that organization, and that's why trusting quite often even what the organizations tell you comes with its risks. The other one is this chap who I know, and to declare I have a type of relationship with him. His name's Fraser Perring, and he runs with 2 other people, another one of the 3 I know, the third one I've never met, called Viceroy Research. So Viceroy are short sellers. So what they would do, typically short sellers bet on the share price of an organization going up or down. What these guys do, which is quite unique, is that they do it based on the concerns of fraud. So they would conduct again, I'm not the expert here, but they would conduct an investigation on an entity that they believed, a big company that they believed maybe was involved in fraud. They would gather the evidence that they believed supported their view that this organization was involved in fraud. And then they'd bet on the market that the share price was going to go down. And then they'd release their evidence into the public domain. And as that gets known, share price goes down, they make a return. I know Fraser because he had an involvement with Steward Healthcare, the company that was linked to Malta in the US. And that's how we got to know each other. But he had there's a number of very high profile sort of legal cases at the moment involving Viceroy and Fraser, but one of them was linked to Steward, and Steward put him under hostile surveillance. Now, what was interesting about this is that this was obviously money, a lot of money. I think it was about $6 million or something. It was a lot. It was being spent by Steward, allegedly, on having their critics put under surveillance. Well, that included his teenage daughter. And there is an image I tried to find it was on Twitter, but I couldn't get it in time. There was an image that he released into the public domain that he'd found through his investigation of being under surveillance of him and his daughter sat on the sofa watching the telly. Now, you go back to that thing I said at the beginning about data protection and GDPR. What legal basis would that investigation firm have for following him? Really, very, very, very questionable. But following or taking pictures of the teenage daughter, no. And also the fact that they were watching telly inside their house, really dodgy, really not acceptable. With that, I didn't go into RIPA into a lot of detail, but one aspect of RIPA relates to what's known as intrusive surveillance. So if someone was taking a picture of a target in their house, that is considered intrusive. Taking pictures of this guy and his daughter watching the telly, first of all, the operative who took it, most likely, I don't know, was on the grounds of their house. So that's trespass, but it's not crime of the century, but not acceptable anyway. But taking a picture of him and his daughter was just not acceptable. And shows the lengths sometimes that people go to. But when that then gets into the public domain, that then would have a reputational issue for the person that instructed it, because they shouldn't be doing that. Fraser Perring's also involved in another link to this, which I suggest you have a look at if you like true crime or you're interested in this sort of thing, relating to an MP called Liam Byrne. So Liam Byrne made statements about Fraser Perring in the Houses of Parliament under parliamentary privilege, linked to the Stewart case, etc., etc. But the point here with Fraser is that he was targeted for hostile purposes, and other people are implicated in that. And that is now in the public domain, and it is being pursued not just by Fraser, but by a number of journalists as to the roles that private investigators play. In the same way, there's a lot of cases at the moment in the public domain with the Chinese government hiring private investigators in the UK to conduct surveillance on their political opponents, etc., etc. So these sorts of cases are now bringing it to the public domain, to the knowledge of the attention of the authorities. And that's why, as I said at the beginning, there are certain cases which I think may end up changing aspects of the law, and that is one of them. For that reason. So as we're coming towards the end, perhaps the most important bit is this, which is how do you as a lawyer protect yourself if you're using private investigators? And I've painted a bit of a bleak picture. The industry isn't all bleak at all. In fact, there's some really brilliant people that do amazing work. It's just you've just got to be careful. And really, I think this comes into two parts. So the first part, and again, just my view, I would, if someone says, oh, I'm a member of this association, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. There's the old boys network. I've seen it happen, and I can't name associations over others. But my view would be, don't look at that as an example of, oh, well, they're obviously of the highest caliber, because as I've demonstrated, that isn't always the case. The two areas I think you need to look into are, first of all, what can you do when you instruct an investigator? And the second thing is, what should they be doing once you've instructed them? And this is kind of my guidance. I hope this is the most important thing for you guys for today. So what can you do? Well, one, you can do some due diligence. That case of the sex pest copper, that's in the public domain. So if you had the name of the person, you can do some research on them, or get someone to do some research on them. Now, there's a moral argument as well about, people make mistakes and, all the rest of it. I get all of that. But you can do your due diligence. You can also check that they're registered with the ICO, or that they've got their insurance. When I first got involved in the industry, because I hired a PI for a court case. I was suing someone. And I as a consumer, called about half a dozen private investigators and spoke to them on the phone. And some of them, it was like talking to Arthur Daly. You didn't know who they were. They wouldn't tell you their names. You couldn't meet them. You couldn't speak to them. You couldn't do a Zoom. So for me, they're massive red flags. Can you meet the person? Can you speak to the person? Do your research on them. Well, that being said, there are some coppers I know in the industry who I trust implicitly, who are involved in high profile crimes that their faces can't be in the public domain because of that. But you can still validate that they are credible, law abiding, ethical, etc. In terms of what should they do, first of all, they should be able to discuss the legitimate interest tests. And that is that if you're going to hire an investigator, they should be able to say what can and can't be done from a legal point of view, and whether, going back to GDPR and data protection, whether there is the legitimate interest there to enable them to possibly gather someone's personal data without their consent, which is one of the reasons why I predominantly work with law firms, because it's a court case is going ahead and there's a legal process, and therefore that ticks a lot of the boxes. The private investigator should also be providing a data protection impact assessment, not the sexiest thing in the world. And it's not something that you see in any of the Hollywood films or TV series of them, filling out that data protection impact assessment. But it is important, because you've got to consider GDPR and data protection. You do anyway, but as an investigator, for me, it's doubly important. An investigator should also be able to identify the relevant laws relating to the work that they're going to do. So, the idea of, if it was a corporate thing, what are the relevant laws relating to accessing, let's say, a work device and the internal policies? They need to be aware of that so they're not falling foul of anything. And most importantly, there should be a contract. It should be absolutely clear who you are working with, what work's going to be done, for how much, when is it going to be reported, what are the payment terms, what are all of that should be at the outset. And any investigator that's not willing to do that is, for me, a major, major red flag. The other thing you can do is just contact me, because even if you don't instruct me or I can't do the work, I'm more than happy to introduce you to people who I do trust, I do have worked with before. And again, we work with law firms all the time anyway, that's our main client, them and corporates. So you can just get in touch and we can have a Zoom for 15, 20 minutes and chat things through. I'm more than happy to do that. So that pretty much comes to the end of my presentation. I hope it's of value. And I think the most important takeaways, I know there'll be some questions as I hand over to David in a second, but I think the most important thing from my point of view is the clarification of who you're working with and the clarification of exactly what they're going to do to protect yourself, so that you're not hiring some sort of Arthur Daly that, again, gets them in trouble, but also gets you in trouble and causes you loads of issues. So with that, I hope that's been of value and of interest. And I will hand back to David, as I know some things have come in the chat, but I haven't pressed it. So I'm assuming there may be one or two questions.
Well, I'm smiling because in the introduction I said, please make sure you use the Q&A for your questions and don't use the chat. And absolutely everyone has ignored me. There isn't a single question in the Q&A, and that's the first time in 5 years that's happened.
Right.
Another comment I've got to make is I think most of your audience probably don't know who Arthur Daly is.
Oh, really? Oh, does that make me just feel really old?
Yeah, so Arthur Daly was a character from a TV series called Minder, and he was like, I think he was a second-hand car salesman, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was, but he had his fingers in all sorts of pies, though, didn't he? He was like wheeler dealer.
That's right. So let's go and have a look in the chat then. I can see someone's cheekily added fireflies to record this. That's the first thing in the chat. The question, which is probably a question for me, do they provide certificate of participation or not? Is that for this course? I'm assuming it's for this webinar. If it is, if that's what the question means, no, we don't normally do that, because the requirement to keep certificates really stopped in 2016, almost 10 years ago. So really the requirement is for you to simply add this webinar into your training record. Next question, do you think AI would replace AI? I think it means AI replace PI.
That's a great question. No, I don't think it will. It may well in certain areas, like, we're seeing the increased use of technology for gathering data online and that sort of thing, which is really a tool. But even then, I don't think it ever will. So, for example, physical surveillance, well, you've got to have boots on the ground for things like that. I think there'll be aspects that will be made more efficient and improved, But I can't see that, and certainly if it does happen before the robots take over, I certainly can't see that in the next few years. I think there'll always be a need for some sort of investigation. And again, it goes back to, well, what sort of investigation? It's like genealogy. That's a type of private investigation, and having we do that for legal clients, and that in itself, it has to be a very intelligent program to know. If you're trying to, we did a genealogy job where it was in Wales. Well, it went so far back that there came a point where everybody was called Jones. So trying to go any further, we just got stuck. I don't know how they would fix that. So there will be limitations, but no, I don't think it will completely, or for a while.
Couple of things, Greg. Someone has actually just used the Q&A. And it says, how do we contact Greg Gillespie for future reference? Your contact details are on your slides, aren't they?
I can put them on the slides. Yeah, you can connect. I'm on LinkedIn. You can just search. If you search, I mean, I know you'll have details. I know if you just search my name, investigator, it'll all come up. You can get in touch via a few ways, via LinkedIn, website, or by yourself.
And then there's another question, playing devil's advocate, since all information is public knowledge, what's the difference between AI and PI apart from physical?
Playing devil's advocate, because all information is in the public domain. What is the difference between artificial intelligence and private investigations? If I've understood the question right, the important thing about as an investigator is gathering the data. So one of the jobs is knowing where the data is, gathering it, understanding it, putting it in a format that relates. So one could argue, well, could AI do that? Well, hypothetically, yes, it could. So I suppose I'll clarify if I've not understood the question, if it related purely to online research and there was no other, so for example, speaking to witnesses, taking witness statements, finding witnesses, trying, all of those sorts of things. A lot of that is interaction. You couldn't do that. But if it's related primarily to online research, then yes, there are tools out there that can bring it all together. But even then, I've yet to see any tool gather it and put it in a format that makes sense in the right way that can be delivered to the client without some sort of human involvement at the moment.
Okay, a question from me. You talked about phone hacking. Now, I haven't Googled this, so I really don't know the answer to this one, but was hacking really the right word? Because weren't these celebrities not using a PIN to protect their voicemails? Isn't that what happened?
Yeah, so phone hacking, so the principle of phone hacking was a third party without the legal right or allowed to do this, intercepting voicemails. Now, we've heard about phone hacking over a long number of years, and across those years, phone security has changed. So even in the case of Prince Harry, some of the things he was talking about were like going back quite some time before things differed. There's an argument to go, regardless of what the security measures were back then or are now, people are not allowed to have access to that private data. So the principle being of phone hacking is regardless of the methodology, because there's also examples of it going via, there's the classic cases of really awful Millie Dowler and her family. I believe it was Millie Dowler's family where an investigator had got into the phone, listened to a voicemail, and done something, either deleted it or had listened to it, and therefore the family heard the fact that someone had been in her phone, and it gave them reason to think that she was still alive, and when sadly she wasn't. So the principle of it is unauthorized access. The way in which that occurred and will continue to occur, the methodology will change, but it was the principle of somebody doesn't have the right to get in to get that data. It all comes back to data, GDPR.
Okay, thank you. Next question, is PI industry a highly regulated one? I think you answered that, didn't you?
Yeah, in fact, there's 2 points here. Is PI industry a highly regulated one? I had a conversation with a lawyer at an event recently. I said, "What do you do?" And she said, "Oh, I'm in PI." I said, "Oh, great, we're chatting away." I didn't realize that was personal injury. So we had a bit of miscommunication there. So in terms of private investigations, the industry is absolutely not regulated at all. Anyone that says they are licensed or they are regulated is being misleading, because it just isn't. And even being associated with certain organizations, which I said in the presentation, when they go, "Oh, it means, look at my reputation, I'm with this organization," I'd be very, very wary of it. I mean, there's another point just above that by Kevin O'Doherty, who's made a point about, "I've been approached by a PI to conduct expert witness services, but I declined once I knew the industry is unregulated." What I would just say to that point is, the industry is unregulated and unlicensed, and there are lots of problems. However, I wouldn't discard working with private investigators, because often a lot of private investigators do boring stuff like tracing and stuff like that. So it's not really something you need to be wary of. I'm highlighting what I believe are the red flags and the things you need to be aware of, but that's not to say that you should avoid all private investigators or anything to do with that industry. I would say the opposite. I would say that the private investigation industry offers huge value to the litigation support services and to lawyers in lots of ways. I always say to clients, look, let's just have a conversation. It costs nothing to have a conversation, and if we can't help you, we can't. That's it. But I wouldn't avoid them. I would just do your due diligence, do your research, and make sure that they are providing the things that I mentioned, because otherwise you might be turning down something that's of huge value to you, but you may also be turning down something that's of huge value to your clients. Now, whether that's something that you subcontract or you white label or whatever it may be, it's really good for you to know what is and isn't out there. So don't sort of discard it just because it's an unregulated industry.
I would add to that most professions, I think, are unregulated. I mean, for example, management consultants aren't regulated. We don't have to have PI insurance. We just choose to have it.
Yeah.
And in fact, most law isn't regulated. So it's only reserved legal activities where a solicitor has to be regulated by the SRA. So in the majority of law is not regulated. So for example, will writing isn't regulated. Citizens advice bureaus have a regulator, etc. So you'd be surprised about just how much professional services are provided without the services of a regulator.
Yeah.
Next one, can certain breaking of boundaries be acceptable depending on the means? For example, in a murder or terrorism trial.
Oh, what a question. Well, that I don't know, and I would imagine, first of all, anything that would be that serious a crime would be dealt with by public bodies. So public bodies would have to have abided by all the legal processes in place. I don't know is the answer. I would be very cautious of it, and I would imagine that the public bodies probably wouldn't want to do that, because even the slightest sort of question of something that they've not done right or ethically or legally or whatever, and there's a risk to the case. So I don't know. It's a very good question. It's almost a philosophical Machiavellian question, isn't it? Where do the ends justify the means? Well, that at that level, I think at any level, it's a dodgy ground to go down. But I don't know. But again, that would be something that would have to go through the minds of the investigators in the police or the security or the intelligence services prior to doing something. And there is an argument as well that whether would they do certain things to be used as evidence, or is it being used to gather intelligence to then get more information to go and do something else? I think these days they'd have to be absolutely watertight in every level. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that you wouldn't be able to compromise. But I don't know that one. You got me on that one.
Interestingly enough, Monique says that perhaps it's different in different jurisdictions. So it may be regulated elsewhere. And she says that I'm from South Africa and it's strictly regulated over
Yeah.
there. So yeah, that's a good
Yeah,
point.
absolutely. And I mean, when we work abroad, we do a lot of work overseas for clients and the other way from overseas coming in. That's the first thing we have to do is check what are the laws in that particular area. Funnily enough, though, just going back to that question before, just thinking about, there was the case I think he was called Steak Knife, who was the guy that was an informant, I believe, for the British government in the IRA. And it was discussed on a podcast with Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, where they had Eliza Manning and Buller, former head of MI5, and the other chap, whose name I can't remember, head of MI6, talking very openly about things. And Steak Knife was a case that she referred to because he, I believe, did stuff as part of his cover as being an undercover operative, was doing stuff that was illegal, and that the argument was, well, he had to do it in order to have the trust of those he was working with that broke the law. And there was this whole moral and legal debate about it. And I believe there's also some quite high profile cases at the moment about police officers who went undercover and had relationships with subjects, and also I believe even had children with them as part of deep cover, which is so I don't know, that's a very complex one at the highest of levels, but there are a lot of cases out there to reference from.
And there's one final question before we finish. Do private investigators have fiduciary duties?
Do they have what, sorry?
Fiduciary duties.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. Clarify that.
Do PIs have fiduciary duties? So in other words, do they have morals and ethics, so they are acting with due care, etc.?
Well, I would argue absolutely should be, but I've seen many, many cases of that not happening. In fact, I've seen, being very sort of careful with my wording here, they should do. And there are organisations that represent private investigators that have codes of we expect our members to abide by. But as you've seen without going into too many details, as you've seen in this presentation, there are cases of, one organisation saying this, but then when a member is actually involved in it, what happened? I don't think anything happened. So in theory, yes, the way I would apply it would be the common sense approach of what is right and what is wrong, and sort of outside of my own moral compass. I can't speak for everyone, but there's a lot out there that don't. There's a lot out there that absolutely do, and there's a lot out there that say they do, but they don't. So I'd just be very, very cautious. And the way that you protect yourself is doing those two things that I mentioned in the presentation. Your research, their responsibilities.
Okay, that's absolutely great. Thank you so much, Greg. I'm just going to finish by confirming that you'll get a copy, a slightly condensed version of the slides, and a link to the recording will be available. You should receive an email very shortly asking you to rate this webinar. So we'll be very grateful if you don't mind just spending a few seconds doing that. And also any comments about the quality or otherwise of this webinar would be highly appreciated. Now, next week we have 3 webinars. There's an anti-money laundering training for lawyers course, a safeguarding for lawyers course, and a legal aid agency audits course. Now, those are paid for webinars, but they are charged at fairly nominal rates starting from £56. So we hope you'll have a look at our training page and consider potentially booking one of those courses. But it just remains for me to say thank you to everybody for joining, and huge thanks to Greg for putting on another really great course. So thank you, everybody, and I wish you a pleasant afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.